Hi guys, Ricky Pope here, and this week on the Christian Nerd Unite podcast, I'm joined by author Jeb Smith, and we talk about his book, Middle-earth Lore, Tolkien's Legends Revealed, plus scripture and nerdy news, and we'll get to all of that right after this. You guys know I love sharing Jesus and my nerdiness with you every week. And as you know, as we're part of the Christian Nerd HQ podcast network. Make sure you check out all the great podcasts there. Go to christiannerdhq.com for the links. Let's read some scripture. Matthew 13, 2-3. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. And Matthew 13, 33-35. He told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophets. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. This week in my interview, Jeb and I discussed Tolkien and Allegory. And that made me think about Jesus always teaching in parables. Parables are basically short allegories. He always used stories to convey deep meaning. These stories helped bring the gospel to life, to connect it with what people already knew. We can also use stories today to communicate the truth of the gospel as well, whether that's through short stories, sermons, or even collaborative storytelling like tabletop role-playing games. I hope that you'll consider how you can use great storytelling to communicate the gospel in fresh new ways. Now for some nerdy news. The Disney Plus animated show X-Men 97 released just a few weeks ago. Rotten Tomatoes initially had a critic review of 100%, unheard of for any Marvel product. No other Marvel show or film has ranked that high. It has since fallen to just a bit to 98%, with an audience review of 93%. Hopefully, the live-action side can take something from this to bring the films and shows back to a higher standard. Max's The Penguin series, a spin-off from Matt Reeves' The Batman, is scheduled to release this fall. There was a lot of speculation that the series would be canceled after production was halted because of the 2023 writer's strike and the new direction that James Gunn is taking DC. But we now know we will see Colin Farrell reprise his role as the Penguin. The trailer looks great and has a DC meets The Sopranos feel. This could be a great win for DC. In our interview today, we talk with author Jeb Smith, and we talk about his book, Middle-earth Lore, Tolkien's Legends Revealed. We talk Tolkien and self-publishing. Let's get right into our interview. Jeb Smith, it is so great to have you on the Christian Nerd Unite podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jeb, tell us a little bit about who Jeb is and how you got into The Lord of the Rings, and we'll dive in a little more into some of the books you've authored.
Right. I live in Rupert, Vermont, in New England. I've lived here my entire life. Tolkien. Really, I was introduced through the movies, through Peter Jackson in the films, and
okay.
I was not into fantasy at all. My brother tried to get me to read The Hobbit when I was a teenager, and I just couldn't do it. I said, I'm not into that kind of stuff. I don't like fantasy. And so I never read the book until the movies came out, and my brother-in-law invited me and my wife to go watch the Two Towers at this time, because I didn't watch Fellowship of the Ring. He tried to get me to read it. And it was Christmas Day, big snowfall in Vermont. You know, we drove 15 miles an hour down the highway because no one was plowing on Christmas Day. I had nothing better to do, so I said, okay, yeah, we'll go to Two Towers. And I just fell in love with the movie, with the Ents, with Rohan, the diverse castles, cultures. So that was my introduction to Tolkien, and I just absolutely fell in love. I finished watching Return of the King, and I wanted, after watching the Return of the King, I wanted to understand Tolkien, the author himself, as a person. And so I started reading biographies on him. I read his letters, and he was my introduction to what I believe was kind of how Western man used to think before the Industrial Revolution, before a lot of the changes in culture that came about, before modernity. And so he was my introduction to a whole philosophy and way of thought that I always felt I was out of the modern world, out of place here. I just didn't feel like I belonged. So when I read Tolkien, I felt like this is my guy. You know, this is how I think. This is who I am. And I just fell in love. And so I wanted to learn more about him. And then of particular interest to me was his Catholic faith, that he was a devout Christian. And I started reading books about how he incorporated that into Middle Earth. And so I just started consuming all sorts of books of that manner. And a lot of people disputed a lot of those things. And so I wanted to kind of investigate myself. At the same time, I was studying the Bible, and I kept noticing themes pop up over and over and over. And so I said, you know, this could be a book. And some of the major themes about that I really fell in love with was his environmental themes, his political, and his religious. So as you're going to ask me about my book, that was the first book where I focus in on those themes that I really admired and liked about Tolkien that he incorporated into Middle Earth. And so I just kind of drew the connections between his own worldview, what he thought was right and wrong, good, evil, and how he transferred that into Middle Earth.
And tell the audience, what was the name of that book?
That's The Road Goes Ever On and On, A New Perspective by J.R.R. Tolkien.
And so when you started, decided I'm going to write this book, what was it that you felt you wanted to communicate in that first book that maybe either hadn't been communicated in some other works, or that you had felt like that was a real connection there for you?
I would say, I mean, there's multiple layers. Probably the political one, I think, was what hadn't been spoken of. It seemed like not a lot of authors addressed Tolkien's politics accurately, in my mind. They kind of came from the modern, right or left political divide, and they tried to drag him over to their side and show where he disagreed with the other one, trying to turn him into a Republican or Democrat. And I think they were completely missing him. You really need to go back to Anglo-Saxon England, read the histories, read the politics of those monarchies, which were vastly different than Americans get the idea. They were actually very libertarian societies. And the kings were very much kind of like Aragorn, where you had these shires and you had these autonomous areas that may be under the realm of a distant king, but they're not affected. They're really governed by their own traditions, customs, and it's like the dwarves of Erebor. You had the elves in Mirkwood. You had the men in Lake Town. They don't combine to try to outvote the other and get their own way. People live in their own little realms, and that's how it was in Anglo-Saxon England, where you had all these. You could have one village with a set of laws and customs, and then the village next to it living completely different, and people would move in between these towns, and the king was, didn't have any effect on them in their life. And that was a sort of kind of anarcho-monarchism, I've heard it described, of Tolkien. And so I try to bring out a lot of that sort of medieval political philosophy before the rise of the modern state, the regulatory state, and tried to show that Tolkien, first, that was his political preference. He didn't like democracy. He didn't vote, things like that. And that he incorporated some of his political philosophy into the free peoples that he agreed with. And then Zoran and Saruman definitely represent some of the more modern tyrannical forms of government, I guess.
Interesting. So when you went about deciding you were going to write a book,
Mhm.
um, now you went the option of self-publishing.
Mhm.
What made you go with self-publishing rather than trying to maybe get maybe get somebody to help you put that together, or to send it into some publishing house to try to
Yeah.
get uh, to go that route?
Right. And so a couple of things. One is like I wrote the first Road Goes Ever On and On with another history book, and it was more of a hobby. I had time. It was during COVID,
Mm,
during the shutdown, and my brother had just actually created his own board game. And I was like, well, what would I do? What do I want to do? If I could do anything, it's write a book. And so I turned my hobby of my own research and interest in the Tolkien into a book. And so I was really a beginner, didn't know what I was doing. I did submit it to a few publishers, and it was actually accepted by Christian Faith Publishing. The Road Goes Ever On and On. And I recently broke the contract with them, so now it's only self-published on Amazon. But
okay.
I didn't have it edited before I sent in. I didn't know about the publishing world. I've learned a lot through these
Mm,
two books. And so, yeah, now writing a book now, I have a couple editors actually that loved my books on Tolkien, and they edited for free. So I have two free editors that are huge Tolkien fans that can double check everything I'm citing, can challenge me or agree with it, give me feedback. And so it's been awesome having them. And so, yeah, things learning, I guess. Self-publishing also has a lot of advantages. I have published a book related to history that's self-publishing. And using Amazon's KDP, it's very easy. It's very efficient. If you're like me, I'm not good with technology and computers and all that kind of stuff. So they make it very easy for someone who wants to learn about publishing and books to jump in there, do it without upfront costs. That's the thing. And they
yeah.
provide the ISBN. They do almost everything for you, and and the cost goes into the book, so you don't have to pay anything up front. It's pretty risk free, and you get free advertisement on Amazon, things like that. But my second book, Middle Earth Lore, it's really for you got to be a big Tolkien nerd to kind of get into it. And I'm not even sure what publisher would take that on, that would be
Mm,
interest. So I didn't even try to submit it anywhere. I had success with earlier self-publishing. I thought I'd go that road. I don't have a podcast or an audience as you do. So
mm,
what traditional publishers are looking for even more, because I've spoken with many on some of the other books I've wrote, and they're looking for someone with an in-place audience because those are guaranteed sales. That's why political hosts, TV
mhm.
editors, they're going to get agreements whether they can write or not. They have ghostwriters
Yeah.
write their book for them. Like, who is it? Prince Charles. I was talking to a publisher. He said, anyone that thinks Prince Charles wrote a word of that book has no idea what the market, what the whole system is about. And so it's really, they're looking for an audience, which makes it difficult to get in with a traditional publisher, especially when your book's written for a very narrow audience. They're not going to want to take a
Mhm.
chance. And so I didn't even try.
Gotcha. Well, tell us a little bit about this second book,
Mhm.
uh, Middle Earth Lore. Now, it's currently on Kickstarter, but the Kickstarter is actually going to end before
Right.
this episode goes out. So, but it was a successful Kickstarter.
Hmm.
You did a pretty small
Yep.
Kickstarter in general, but you had enough backers to go ahead and
Mhm.
get that Kickstarter completed. So, the book makes sense that it's going to happen
Right.
for you.
Yep.
But tell us a little bit more about that book, and how that one came to be, why it's different than the first one,
Mhm.
those kind of things.
Yeah, and so the first one really focused on J.R.R. Tolkien himself. It was a form of biography, but going through Middle Earth. So I'd look at his worldview, what he thought about religion or the environment or politics were the three areas I focused on, and
Mm,
how he incorporated those into Middle Earth. And I'm not saying that it was an allegory in any way. I'm saying that inevitably, if someone writes a book, they're going to be involved. If a Christian writes a
yeah.
book, it's going to be different than an atheist, whatever the subject is,
Hmm.
because they're coming from a different perspective. And so that's why I was saying with Tolkien, I'm like, inevitably, he's going to prefer certain systems. The free people are going to have more freedoms, and the tyrants, in that way. And so that's more of the first book, is looking at Tolkien himself through Middle Earth. And the second one is focused on Middle Earth. But I start out, I would say, if there's one theme, is to try to allow the reader to understand and look at Middle Earth as Tolkien would. Tolkien was clear. He said, he doesn't care. He wants people to view Middle Earth as they do. He doesn't want to force the way he looks at it onto them. But I am also interested. I want to know how Tolkien understood this thing. What does he want us to think? And so he really wanted us to have the perspective that it was an actual history. It wasn't mythology or kind of like a Disney sort of fantasy. He thought Middle Earth was an actual history with actual events. Not that it happened, it was a mythological setting, but he wanted us to understand it as if it was a real history. And so I go into the first chapter really focuses on Tolkien's view and kind of making that case. And then it moves along looking at different aspects of lore, looking at Peter Jackson's films, how he handled it, how to depict Middle Earth, how to understand the Silmarillion. And I kind of sought to correct what I thought were misunderstandings of lore among nerds and on Tolkien forums and things like that we talked about, different creatures or people and things like that. And I tried to, in everything, have that Tolkien's perspective and clarify what I thought were mistakes that a lot of Tolkien nerds had, and to make my case, I guess.
And if I understand correctly, the second book, Middle Earth Lore, you have a lot of illustrations or graphics in this book that you didn't have in the first book. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. There's, I think I brought sorry, bit of a cold. I think I brought over maybe 2 images from the first one that were just really good images. I'm like, I paid for them. I want them. I'm bringing them over to the second one. But as a general rule, like I was saying, a main theme was to present Middle Earth as Tolkien expected it to be, or as I thought he would understand it to be. So I include a lot of images of different portrayals of just creatures and things like that I thought had been misportrayed by a lot of Tolkien authors. So I tried to bring in the text and say, this is what it says. I think this is what it should look like, or what I think Tolkien had in mind. And so, yeah, I was fortunate to get, there's maybe a dozen authors that contributed, and there's some really, really good artwork in the book. And a lot of it is simply, it's just visual for beauty, but it's also a lot of sketch work too, is to kind of give what I think is the correct visual presentation. And I spent some time in chapter 2 on Peter Jackson, and I mentioned some of the things I think he got wrong or he exaggerated in the movie, where I think he strayed from Tolkien's presentation. But I also argue that his use of John Howe and Alan Lee especially was just perfect. And he had that also. He got everyone together. He said, I want you to think this is an actual history. These things really happened. And I want to look and portray and function as if as if this world were real. And doing that and using Alan Lee as the lead designer and artist, I think he really nailed overall the presentation that Tolkien would go for. Besides, like the half dozen things that I talk about that I dispute in the book, overall the presentation was very well done. So in a way, I'm adding on to that. I'm also correcting a few things, or what I believe is correcting a few of the mistakes that he made, because obviously he had the biggest impact on people's visuals of what Middle Earth looked like, because the movies were so popular.
So since you do feel like there's some things that maybe Jackson didn't do exactly the way Tolkien would have envisioned it, or that nerds envision it a different way in general, what are a couple of things that you think are kind of, this is what Tolkien probably really meant, but this is what people think of when they see it, hear it?
Well, I would say as far as Peter Jackson's, the Mumakil, they were presented as being like 30 or 40 foot in height. These huge, powerful animals that are sweeping all the Rohan soldiers away, and really it takes the army of the dead pretty much to take them out. But in Tolkien's writing, he said they were just large historical elephants. And I went back at some of the largest fossils that we found of elephant kind of animal, woolly mammoth type, and so I said, I think this is what Tolkien had in mind. He described them, and they're kind of just a few feet taller than a large male African elephant. And in the battle, they're not even described as charging the enemy. It almost seems like they're used mostly to move siege equipment around. And then they were used as defensive towers in a way that the Haradrim and other orcs rallied after the Rohirrim came and kind of broke their lines the first time. And they ended up all getting killed in the battle. I'd say another big one is the Army of the Dead. I think they were exaggerated. The book doesn't even make clear that they killed anyone. They weren't at Minas Tirith, they just cleared out the valley. It said their main weapon was fear. And Legolas says, I can't say if their swords still bite or sting, or I forget what he said, but he couldn't confirm any kills at all. And so they were definitely exaggerated in their power. I remember watching them in the movie, and I'm thinking, if they're that powerful, just take them into Mordor and end this thing, just wipe everyone out. Why doesn't that happen? And so obviously in the books they would appear and act very different than they did in the movies. Probably the main driving force behind the book, as far as misunderstandings among nerds, is First Age creatures. Some of the powerful dragons, the Balrogs, the angelic beings that Tolkien, I believe, I start chapter 3 describing his use of hyperbole, especially in his writings of the First Age. And Tolkien was a medievalist, he studied that type of writings. And when they talked about the older ages in their myths and legends, things like that, they exaggerated purposely. And their audience knew that. And Tolkien was doing the same thing. And he made it clear it's in the Silmarillion, it's in the foreword, it's in letters. But people seem to, once they get in a story, maybe they get caught up in it. And they kind of take some of the exaggerated language as being more of an accurate, description, kind of a recording like the Third Age was. And Tolkien's clear, the Third Age is a historical recording. The First Age is passed down through legends, through the Numenorians, and mythological. It's not exactly, there's a lot of exaggeration and hyperbole in there. And so a lot of people, you look at some of the artwork of some of the dragons and the Valar and some of the creatures, and they're these monstrous, just epic, godlike creatures. And Tolkien would see them much more, I think, as angelic beings and even saints. And I include, and I have the citations for that in there as well. So I'd say they see a huge downfall, a lot of people, in what you'd consider maybe the military might and the power of the creatures and the societies in the Third Age, as if it's kind of a drop, whereas Tolkien's more says that about the culture and the distancing of the elves and the Valar, and men are kind of on their own now, and evil is kind of emerging, and it's not so much the military aspect. So that's a lot of what chapter 3 is based on.
Well, one of the big, I don't know if this is a argument, but one of the big things that people will say often is that Tolkien explicitly says it's not an allegory, and he doesn't like allegories.
Yeah.
But most of the people who say that base it on a particular quote, and haven't looked at some of his other quotes,
right?
Because at one point he does say, it's an, what does he say? That it's of course my story is not an allegory of atomic power, but of power, which means it is an allegory. It's just not the allegory you thought it was.
Yeah.
And another statement that he makes is that it is, even though he, at some points he says it's not religious, it's not an allegory of any Christian faith, but then he later comes back and says it is a very Catholic story.
Right.
It is a very religious story. almost as though he's just kind of come to the realization that maybe it was an unintentional allegory. What are your thoughts on that and his some of his seemingly contradictory comments there?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I have a little appendix in my book on allegory because obviously, in The Road Goes Ever On and On, I talk a lot about, I guess you'd say, allegory. And so Tolkien saw, like the quote you mentioned that everyone quotes, it's not an allegory. That same letter, he goes on, anyway, this stuff is all about power, God, and all these other things that we would describe as allegory. So he didn't want the purposeful, he was talking to Lewis about this, of taking a direct part of Christianity or anything like that and incorporating it into it. But like I said earlier, his worldview was in such a way that things would inevitably match up how he thought. And, he said, my work is a Christian and religious work. People are going to be able to know I'm a Christian by my writings. He expected a reader of Lord of the Rings to know this guy is a writing. And so what I'd say, a lot of the connections I make in Lord of the Rings to the Christian themes are like pride comes before a fall. Something like that. I'll take a Bible verse, a principle from that you'd say is a Christian belief or something. And then I'll go through all the times Smog, Bilbo, Saruman, you can go through the entire work, all his works. And if someone, it goes back to the first age too, when someone becomes very prideful, very shortly, they're going to meet their fate in Tolkien's works. So it's things like that. It's not like he's specifically taking an example from the Bible and putting it in, but those principles and kind of the Christian worldview is incorporated into it without directly, purposely saying, I'm doing an allegory for this. It's that I believe, pride's going to come before a fall. Here's a bunch of examples throughout Tolkien's works where it's included. But he definitely, over and over, he said that his was an allegory, but it's not. It's like I said, it's not the purposeful allegory, but it's definitely there in many ways.
Yeah, it's not the C.S. Lewis, the lion is Jesus,
where he dies and comes back and things like that. Yeah,
yeah, it's not the explicit allegory. It's a different kind of allegory,
right?
And I think that I've always thought that was fascinating that everybody quotes this particular letter of his, but seemingly hasn't explored some of the others.
At least a dozen times he said it's an allegory for different things, but it's just it's a different form, I guess. How you define what an allegory is, I guess. He never set out purposely to incorporate some Christian meaning or thing like that, but it inevitably is going to be drawn in because of him, because his worldview, the way he thought, and all that kind of stuff. And he didn't say, "Oh, I'm going to write a book about power or about Hitler, or Zalman's going to be Hitler," but his thoughts about Hitler, his thoughts about power, match things in the real world because that's what he knew, and it transferred over, but not intentionally.
Yeah, Frank Turek was on the show, I don't know, a year or so ago, and he's a theologian and apologetics guy, and I asked him. We were talking about superhero stories, and I asked him, "Why do you think that so many of these characters have kind of a Christian thought behind them, or this, there's some God element or that we can find, that we can point to and say, that's kind of this thing." And his comment was, they can't help themselves. We're in a world created by God. They were created by God. They can't help not putting those things in there, because that's where our creative, that's where
that divine
we were
image
created. Yeah, that divine image is built into them, and they can't help reflect it, even if they don't intentionally. And ever since he said that, I was fascinated by that idea. And then when you get to somebody like Tolkien, who says, "Yeah, I didn't intend this to be a Christian work, but I can't help that
Right.
my Christian ideals are
Right.
going to be part of this work.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
just it's who I am. I can't help that.
Yeah.
And I thought that's a brilliant idea.
And yeah, I mean, I love that quote. I agree with it fully. I think God, created us with our conscience, and there's the eternal law and what's right and what's wrong, and we can't
Mm,
really. I mean, it's ingrained. I once heard someone went around and interviewed the mass murderers around the world, like the worst serial killers, all that, different
mm,
countries, to try to see what kind of similarities they could find. And so the interviewer said, almost without question, they all said murdering children was wrong, rape was wrong, stealing, all these things that these people committed over and over. And she'd say, well,
mhm,
how do you justify what you did? And they always had an excuse. Usually they were doing it for the greater good or the greater society. Like Hitler didn't wake up saying, oh, I'm going to be mean today and kill Jews for no reason. He thought he was
mm.
doing a greater good. And I mean, obviously that doesn't justify their actions. But the thing is, even the worst of us, the very worst of us, recognize what's right and wrong. Like it's
Yeah.
ingrained into us. And what was the question about Tolkien?
I don't know that I had a question. It was just the connections there. I think are brilliant.
Right. Yeah.
But
That's what I was going to say. Is one of Tolkien's purpose was to present the Christian worldview, and I'd argue kind of the medieval Christian worldview,
mm,
in a mythological setting, so that'd be more acceptable to people. I'm
mm,
sure you've heard of Joseph Pierce. He's a Tolkien
yeah.
scholar, and he was talking about evangelism, and he was talking about the gospel in Tolkien in different, ways in which it's subtly presented. Again, not purposely. And he talked about how myths and legends, and talking about Tolkien, he said he can go to a university, hundreds of students will show up if he's talking about Tolkien. And he said he can present the gospel through Tolkien's works and through Tolkien and his writings. He said he'll go to the
Hmm.
same university a year or two later and talk specifically about evangelism. He said he gets a couple dozen people at best. And Tolkien believed that too. Tolkien, in he
Absolutely.
saw Christianity. It happened in England a little faster than America, but it decayed away. And he said, "This is a secular society that I'm living in." He felt definitely out of place, and he thought the direct evangelism was not working as well, and that there were people already doing that. And so him and Lewis both said myths is a way to kind of sneak in through the back door, I think is what Joseph Pierce said, of how to get the gospel to people.
Yeah.
When people see things in a mythological setting, it happened to me, it becomes more real in our world. You can see things clearer in myths, good and evil, presented
Hmm.
there. And then you come back to our world and you're like, wait a second, that's happening here. It's not as clear, but it is happening exactly. And it almost helps you see our world more clear, good and evil. Yeah. One of the main takeaways
I love that. So, you said that before all of this, before you saw the Lord of the Rings movies, you weren't into fantasy.
Yeah.
Now, now at this point in your life, are you into more fantasy in general, or are you just really a Tolkien fan?
I mean, by and large, I'm just a Tolkien fan, but I've definitely, especially with Lewis, expanded out. Reading some of the writings of G.K. Chesterton and Tolkien and Lewis help make me see fantasy in a different mindset, in a different
Mhm.
way, and I see much more value in it. Whereas before I thought it was just a silly form of entertainment, I now see it more the way they did, and so I can definitely enjoy much more fantasy. I've Harry Potter's one I want to get in just because it's so famous. I've watched the movies, but I always said those books are going to be great, and so that's the next on my fantasy list. I'm trying to get through Divergent. I'm not sure if that really counts, but kind of. I've
That's more of a sci-fi
Yeah,
dystopian.
yeah.
I'm more of a sci-fi guy.
Okay.
I really enjoy Tolkien, and I love the Lord of the Rings books.
Mhm.
But overall, I'm more of a sci-fi
Well,
guy.
I have to ask you
I read
something.
very other. I read very little other fantasy
Hmm.
other than Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Have you seen Firefly, the show?
I have.
You have, and what did you think?
I enjoy it.
I love it.
It's a good show.
It is a good show.
Absolutely.
You said you were sci-fi. I had to ask because
Yeah.
that's arguably my favorite show of all time. So,
Yeah, when I get into sci-fi, I really enjoy older sci-fi novels.
okay.
Stuff that was written in the 50s, 60s,
Okay, well.
70s. So that's kind of part of my niche. Like
Yeah.
Starship Troopers, the book,
Yeah.
is one of my favorite books ever. Great book. Don't watch the movie. The movie's horrible. But going, kind of moving on here. You've written these two books focused on Tolkien. Do you see yourself writing more on Tolkien or on some other fantasy subject, or were these just two books that you felt like you needed to get out?
Yeah, I think it's probably some people have requested me do a second edition, which is a possibility of doing The Road Goes Ever On and On, a second edition of that. But I think as far as interest, there's nothing out there right now that would interest me enough to go through all the work of publishing another book. So it would have to be, I've thought about writing one on my own. There's a possibility of that, but I definitely right now I'm focused on some historical books, and then when I finish it up, we'll see where it goes after that.
Awesome. Well, for those who are interested, where can they get a copy of the book, and where can they find you to follow you?
Yeah, Amazon on KDP, you can get The Road Goes Ever On and On, and Middle-earth Lore, Tolkien's Legend Reveals comes out on Tolkien Reading Day, March 25th, and it can be pre-ordered on ebook, and you can find me on Facebook, Jeb Smith.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'll put links down to all of that down in the show notes below.
Awesome.
Anything else before we go?
No.
Well, Jeb,
thank you for having me on.
Absolutely, Jeb. It's been a joy having you on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Same here.
It was great getting to know Jeb. And if you want to grab a copy of one of his books or follow him on social media, make sure you check out the links down in the show notes below. Well, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow. Just click all those links down there. And that way you can keep up with us anytime we put out new content. You can find all of our social links to our YouTube channel, and our online store at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. If you enjoy the show and want to help even more, consider becoming a partner on Patreon. All of our Patreon levels have great benefits and make a huge difference in the ministry we're able to do. Supporters will get to hear exclusive stories of believers we're serving around the world through our ministry partners. To check it out or partner with us, go to patreon.com/ChristianNerdsUnite or ChristianNerdsUnite.com and click support in the menu. And don't forget to check out ChristianNerdHQ.com for more great podcasts. Before you go, I do want to leave you with this blessing from Philippians 1. And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. We'll see you next week. Blessings.
Hey.